was while I was driving through the vast yellow grass of the Great Plains that my life ended. I was on my way to see my parents who lived in a small town in western Iowa. The fastest route was straight down I-90 through South Dakota. I knew it was going to be a long and exhausting trip, minus 14 hours to be exact, so I made sure to pack plenty of snacks and drinks. I always hated stopping too often and making an already long road trip even longer. I know the first thing some of you are going to say, why didn't you just fly? Well, if you're from any of the states in the middle of the country, you would know that you never fly so long as your destination is on the same continent. But now, after all that I've been through, I really wish that I had flown. It's a mistake that I can truly say will haunt me for the rest of my life. When I was on a particularly empty stretch of the interstate, there were no other cars on the road with me, not even driving westbound on the other side. Absolutely nothing to see, and I was used to it. I listened to a podcast about something that I don't even remember and slowly slipped into a classic case of highway hypnosis. I don't know for how long, and I don't know what snapped me out of it. All I know is that I got a sudden sense that something was off. I checked the usual suspects, my phone still had plenty of reception, and my car was at almost a full tank of gas. Those being the two things that usually snap you out of that interstate trance. I went back to doing nothing. And then I realized what wasn't there. I hadn't seen a single car in minutes. Obviously, that doesn't sound scary when I say it. It really wasn't, but it was very strange. I had gone an extraordinarily long time in the middle of the day on a Saturday without seeing a single car. My brain told me not to worry, that it was perfectly ordinary, and that I would see someone else sooner or later. And heck, maybe I saw a bunch of cars in the last few minutes and just zoned them out. But then I noticed something else that was missing, something that I absolutely would have come across, not a single exit, not a single billboard, and once I began to pay attention, not a single mile marker. That's when my stomach got a little uneasy, when my brain started sending out some serious red flares. I grabbed my phone from its mounted charger and switched apps to my GPS. I had left it on in the background to occasionally check the time and distance left on my trip. If I stared at it the whole time, I would drive myself crazy, pun intended. But if I switched over every once in a while just to see the numbers go down, it was like a little treat, a tiny dopamine rush to get through this slog. But when I switched to the app, I saw nothing on it but a straight line. No time until arrival and no distance to destination, not even a road label on the line on the screen. I slowed the car to a stop and turned on my hazards. After a moment of hesitation, I pinched my fingers on the screen to zoom out and see. Once again, nothing but a straight line, no matter how far I went. It was impossible that I was on anything else but I-90, but it made absolutely no sense that there were no drivers, signs, exits, or literally anything other than yellow grass fields. I got out of my car and looked around. I kicked at the pavement, which to me seemed completely ordinary, and then I realized that my phone probably just lost signal, and that's why my GPS app was acting up. I even chuckled to myself for being so dramatic as I looked to the top right corner of the screen, only to see a full connection. A million thoughts ran through my mind, some of them less sane than others. I closed out the app and reopened it, only to be met with a pop-up that I had never seen before. No GPS connection. I double-checked, but obviously my location settings were still on. I hadn't touched them since I had started my trip. I had no need to. Yet still, my phone couldn't place me. I dialed my mom's number, my heart rate raised just slightly with every chime of the tone, but to my relief, I heard the familiar voice of my mother answering. We talked for a bit, and I told her what was going on. She laughed it off. "It's very empty out there, you know. and those silly phones bug out all the time. Honestly, your generation puts too much trust in them. I rolled my eyes but thought that maybe she was right. Was it really out of the question that my GPS app had a server failure? I told her that I would get back on the road and call her when I was closer. When we said our goodbyes, for some reason I felt it especially important to tell her that I loved her before hanging up. As I got back into the driver's seat, I remembered one of the other details that really unnerved me. No exits? Sure, it's the middle of nowhere. No billboards? Fine, a little out of character for the Midwest, but possible. No mile markers, though. My brain's only logical justification was that when I was panicking earlier, time seemed to slow down and what felt like forever was actually less than a mile. Yeah, it was a stretch longer than the road that I was on, but it was the only possibility that I could think of to ease my worries. And so I set off, this time paying extra attention to my odometer. 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15, eventually 50 miles. 50 miles without seeing a single green marker at the side of the road. I stopped my car again. I looked at my phone, which thankfully still had full connection. Mom? Yeah, it's me again. No, I'm not any closer. Don't laugh, but this is really starting to freak me out. I think I'm going to call the highway patrol, just to see if they can look out for my car. Yeah, okay, I'll call you back after. Goodbye. Love you, Mom. And I called the highway patrol. To their credit, they sent people out despite how crazy I must have seemed. The lady on the other end asked me what mile marker I was near. I tried to explain to her that I couldn't find a mile marker, not a single one in over 50 miles. She asked me what the last town I remembered going through was. Murdo, South Dakota, I said. And then she told me to stay put and to turn on my hazards. I gave them the description of my car's make and model, and I hung up the phone. Just for a moment before I called my mother back, I stared off into the distance, into the vast and empty plains. I realized there were no hills, no trees, no shrubs, and I described the situation to my mom. I told her everything, and we talked for several hours about our plans when I arrived, about some drama between my mom and her co-workers, anything that would make my situation seem normal. And we went on until I got a call from the highway patrol. And what the lady on the other end of the line told me shot my anxiety past anything leading up to this point. As I stared into the cloudless blue expanse, and at the sun in the middle of the sky, what was unmistakably that same noon on a Saturday, the lady said to me, "We're calling off the search for the night because of the dark storm. If you're still in need of assistance, please call back." I hung up the line and sat in silence. The dark. The storm. Eventually, I turned my car back on. The dashboard said 9:37. I had a half tank of gas now. That little orange needle bobbed ever so slightly back and forth as I thought. I made my decision and shifted into drive, through the grassy median onto the opposite stretch of road. Wherever I was, however I got there, I knew that I didn't want to go any farther into it. My best hope was to return the way that I came. And so I did. I drove and continued like nothing was the matter, until my music was interrupted by the jingle of a phone call. My dad. He told me that it was nearly 10 a.m. the next day. He told me how my mother was hysterical, how the highway patrol couldn't find me. He asked me what I was doing, what my surroundings looked like. Were there any defining features? I told him straight there was nothing. The sun hadn't moved, not an inch. The road never curved or dipped. There were no signs and no animals and no clouds in the sky. Not a single rocky bluff or lone cottonwood tree. Nothing but empty grassland, twin ribbons of gray asphalt to split it, and me. I told him that my gas was almost out, and I joked that he should come and bring me some more. My worry only worsened when my usually jovial father couldn't muster a chuckle. We talked for a while, then he told me stories from my childhood, the first time that we played ball, the first time that he took me to work with him. I teared up when he told me how proud he was of what I had become. And I had to stop the car, my throat tied and nearly swollen shut from the sorrow. And then my mom took the call. She told me all about the day that I was born, every little detail. What time it was, how much I weighed, about what she ate for breakfast that day, and how hard I was to deliver. But also about how worth it all was in the end. As she told me that she loved me, I was a mess as I said it back. I told them that I would call again in a moment, that I needed to get my bearings right. And then I drove until the little orange needle kissed the E. I stared at the haunting 0 on my dash, the number that told me how many miles I had left, and I coasted it out as long as I could, until my car had slowed to a stop. I didn't react. I just sat there, munching on a granola bar that I had packed. And then I slept into an uneasy slumber and awoke to the bright sun above me and to a car so sweltering that I could have easily overheated. For a while I cooled down in the little sliver of shade on the side of my car. That's when I stared down at the pavement. I studied every minute detail, every crack and dip. There wasn't a single ant, no fly in the air, not any kind of bug. I emptied my car of all the food and drinks that I had, put it all in one of my duffel bags that I emptied of clothes that I no longer needed, and slung the bag over my shoulder as I continued my journey on foot. I realized that I had to take this last chance to warn anyone else. 100% battery, I left it on the charger as I drove because I knew deep down that once this device ran dry, I would lose all connection to the outside world. Before this phone dies, I will call every person that I can think of. I will say my farewells, I will forgive what I can, I will hope to be forgiven. It's a better end than most get, I suppose, and maybe somehow my loved ones will get some closure too, though I doubt anyone will ever truly understand what has become of me. But I didn't want my mother to blame herself. I didn't want her to live the rest of her life in grief. So I called her back. I told her that I had found an oasis cool water, so many animals to eat, so many trees to use. I told her that even though we'll probably never see each other again, that I will be alive and well over here. And as I told her all those fairy tales while simultaneously staring at the same expanse of nothingness, we both knew that I was lying, but neither dared to say so. At this point, I am certain that I will die. Will that go slowly from starvation or from thirst, or will I find a way to end it sooner? Will I cling to the last shred of life that I have left, fill my mouth with prairie grass, slog on until the malnutrition takes me? I'm not sure. My delusional mind still wants to debate, wants to believe these are choices that I won't have to make. But deep down, I know that's where this path will take me. Though I do not know where this cursed road leads, I do know where it will end, at least where it will end for me. And so now I write this all out. I write it as I sit in the corner of the road, so far that even my car is now lost. I eat the last of my rations, and I leave you with one final message. Never take this road. Never follow it into the middle of nowhere. And if you must do so, pray that you do not end up where I have. To everyone who knew me, goodbye. I was delivering a truckload to a company on the far west coast, coming from the east coast. The route across the country is one I've taken many times before, being a truck driver for almost 20 years. It's always the same every time I make one of these drives, same roads, same truck stops, and same everything. Over these 20 years, though, I've never really had anything crazy happen. I've had a few odd scenarios, but they never amounted to anything. So, when I was driving this route again, I had no worries in my mind. It was just another day on the job. About 20 hours into the route, a storm started coming over and slowing down my driving. It was late too, so by then I was already looking for the next truck stop to sleep at. As I drove though, a very sudden light appeared behind me. The road I was on was flat and straight, so I would have seen them coming in my mirror. But all of a sudden, they were right behind me. Maybe they had just turned on their lights or something. I didn't know. But they very quickly came right up to the back of my truck. I kept my eyes on them until they got so close that they were completely covered by the trailer. All I could see were their headlights reflecting off the back, but then their lights shut off. I maintained my speed and kept looking back at my mirrors, trying to see if they were still behind me, but I had no way to know. For someone to turn off their lights in the middle of a heavy storm was insane, and to be tailing behind me so closely was just as insane. Thankfully, a sign showed a truck stop was only 5 miles ahead, so at least I knew I was close to getting away from whatever this was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on just some weird behavior, but as a trucker, it's hard not to think about the possibility of it being an attempted robbery, especially when alone on the road at night. For the rest of the 5 miles, I saw no signs of them behind me. I was still on edge because I couldn't really see anything anyway, but I started feeling less worried as I was coming in on the truck stop. I pulled in, trying to check my mirrors to see if they followed, but with the rain and lack of lighting, it was really too hard to tell. The truck stop was mostly empty though, aside from a few trucks at the gas pumps. I pulled off to the side and parked in the middle of the lot. After waiting a minute and getting some of my stuff organized, I opened the truck door and leaned my head out, looking along the side of the trailer. I was drenched from the rain in just a matter of seconds, but from what I could tell, there was no car behind me. I closed the door and finally felt a bit of relief, grabbing my pillow and blanket from the passenger side. I locked the doors, turned off the truck, and tried to get some shoe-dye. The rain pounding on the metal roof made it easy to fall asleep, blocking out any possible sounds coming from other trucks pulling in and out. When I woke up though, I felt like I had only been asleep for a few minutes. I looked around, seeing it was still dark out and the storm was the same, if not worse. But before I could check my mirrors, a loud thump shook the truck. My eyes opened wider. I reached for the door handle and opened it, looking out at the back of the trailer. Through the rain, I could barely see the outline of a car with its headlights off and 2 men moving around in front of it. Terrified, I hesitated to step out and confront them. As I sat there in that moment of hesitation, the door suddenly slammed against my body, shoving me back further into the driver's seat. Another man stood outside, yelling at me to stay where I was, then slammed the door again. His right hand was shoved in his hoodie, and with 2 other men behind the truck, I was in no position to try anything. I could feel the truck shake as I just sat in place, with the guy outside my door watching my every move. He didn't even look away for a second. This went on for a few minutes, then they ran back to their car and drove off. I was still in shock, watching their car disappear onto the road. I called the police and put in a report, but no information ever came up on who the men were. All I know is that if I had been any less aware and had just tried to drive off at the first sight of the men, I probably wouldn't have made it out as safely as I did. This happened when I was 18, making the road trip from my hometown to my new college. I had all my stuff shoved into the trunk and back seat of my cheap SUV. This was not only my first long road trip alone, but also going to be my first time being away from my family for an extended amount of time, so my nerves were reasonably high. Anyway, the directions I was taking said it was 600 miles in total, which I split into 2 days of driving. I was taking whatever route the maps had me take, and it estimated I'd make it to the hotel at 11 p.m. However, with possible traffic, gas stops, and getting food, I knew I'd likely get there much later. By 7 p.m., the sun was fully gone, and most of the cars were gone too. Every once in a while a car would pass by, and I'd see their headlights slowly fade out in front of me, but for most of the drive it was just me. This actually made me really tired and bored. Around 10, I decided I'd stop at the next gas station before making the final stretch of the drive. About 10 minutes later, I exited the road and entered a gas station. Being so far out, this wasn't a town or anything. It was literally just a gas station with a few pumps and a tiny convenience store. I didn't see any other cars on the road, in the lot, or even any lights from nearby houses or buildings in the distance. I pulled right up to a pump and got out to start topping off my tank. As I looked around, I almost got jump scared by a guy walking up to me. In comparison to myself, he was much older, probably in his 50s, if I had to guess, and he honestly looked homeless. Regardless, being approached out here wasn't something I was expecting, and his short smile didn't make me feel any more comfortable. "Do you need something?" I said, hoping he wouldn't walk any closer. The man stopped a few feet from my car and looked around almost cautiously before responding, "Take the exit back onto the highway." I looked at him confused, not sure if I was understanding him right. He pointed behind me at the exit I came from and repeated himself, "Take the exit back onto the highway." After a second, I said okay, and the man walked off. I was still really confused. The exit I came from that he wanted me to take again was a one-way road, so by his logic, he wanted me to drive on the wrong side of the road and do a U-turn back onto the highway. It just didn't make any sense. I looked out at the entrance road, the obvious one that I was supposed to take, and there were no signs of any construction or anything blocking it. It just looked like an empty ramp back onto the highway. As I put the pump back and got in my car, I glanced over at the man, who was now just sitting against the side of the convenience store. The more I thought about it, the more crazy that man seemed, just sitting out here, saying nonsense. I thought maybe this was some kind of trap or something, so I went with my instinct and drove out of the lot and toward the entrance to the highway. As I merged onto it though, I realized pretty much all the street lights were out. I slowed down, thinking maybe this was a construction zone or something. I kept my eyes focused on the road directly ahead, making sure to be cautious of anything. But while I made my way through the unlit road, I saw only a brief outline of a figure to my left before a pickup truck came out of nowhere and stopped right in front of my car. Every door opened as 4 men jumped out of the truck and started running up to my car holding weapons of all kinds: metal bats, machetes, knives, and they didn't even have anything covering their faces. They just had this emotionless gaze, like they felt nothing for what they were doing. I quickly started backing up as they got just a few feet away from my windows. Once I got far enough back, I suddenly saw the outline of dozens of people coming out of the shadows off the side of the road. A few even tried chasing my car as I frantically reversed out of there. As soon as I could, I turned around and sped off. I called 911 once I felt I was safe, but for some reason I never got a call back, no update on it at all. Almost like they didn't even check on it. Ironically though, it was the creepy old guy at the gas station who tried to prevent me from getting caught up in that mess. At least that's what I assumed he was doing. Either way, I was incredibly lucky to get out of that with my life, as I have no idea what that was or what they were all planning to do. I was driving back from a friend's house who lives an hour away. We lost track of time, so I didn't leave until around 2 a.m. I was really tired, and the drive was really boring. Most of the way home was a long, straight road that didn't seem to have a single other car on it. For the first 20 minutes, it was just me staring at the endless pavement ahead and trying not to let my eyes shut. Then my headlights suddenly lit something up on the road ahead of me. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as I got closer, I had to slow down and eventually stop. There was a semi-truck parked in the middle of the road, blocking both lanes. I sat there for a few seconds, having no clue what I was seeing. At this point on the road, we were at least 30 minutes from town, and there was nothing out here. The only reason anyone would stop out here is if there was an emergency. I looked to the right of the truck, and there might have been enough room for me to get around the trailer, but there was a steep hill on the shoulder that would have been really risky to drive on the edge of. The other side of the truck had trees too close together for me to drive between. After being there for a whole minute, I figured this had to be an emergency, and that my best, and maybe only, option was to check on them. I got out of my car and began walking up to the front of the trailer. I remember how quiet it was outside, like the night was completely still and empty. As I got up to the front, I realized the light was on in the driver's cabin. I went up to the door and lightly knocked on it, then called out, asking if they were okay. The window was too high up to see through, so I couldn't see anything from the ground. After a few seconds, there was still no response. I called out again, but there wasn't even the sound of any movement inside. My gut was telling me that something was seriously off about this. I looked down the road ahead, then back at the road I came from, seeing nothing but fog in the distance. It only reminded me how far away I was from anyone else. I grabbed the side of the door and lifted myself up onto the steps, then looked inside the window. There was stuff scattered everywhere, almost looking like they had crashed or something, making the whole cabin a total mess, but nobody was inside. Then I noticed the door on the other side was wide open. I stepped back onto the road and began walking around the truck to investigate the open door, but stopped in my tracks when I saw a man in the forest walking up the side of the hill. He was tall, with shoulder-length hair, and had a very disheveled appearance. "Hey man, are you okay?" I asked. The man didn't look at me, but continued coming up from the forest and onto the road. In the faint light coming from my headlights, I saw dark red stains all over his clothes, and his face was covered in dirt and grime. Thinking he was clearly not okay, I offered to help, but he continued to not even acknowledge me. That was until I said I could call 911 for him. He immediately stopped walking and shot a look at me, holding eye contact for a few long seconds. "I'm fine," he said in a deep, threatening tone. I stopped talking and watched him get into the truck. I rushed back to my car as the truck started driving away. I turned around and drove right back to my friend's house, where I called 911 and gave every detail I could remember. Unsurprisingly, the case never went further than that. What happened on that road is still a mystery, one that terrifies me. The way the truck was stopped, being sideways, with the cabin looking as chaotic as it did, makes me think something or someone forced them to stop. What happened afterward is debatable, but the man I saw probably wasn't the original truck driver. I think we can all assume what likely happened in the forest below the road. I work for my dad at his small construction business. He runs a yard and warehouse full of materials, as well as manages the job sites the workers are at. Since I was only 17 at the time, my job was to basically be the errand boy. I'd drive materials back and forth and pick up anything that was needed. Depending on the job, though, some materials would need to be there before workers arrived because they would need them to get started right away in the morning. So every once in a while during busy weeks, I'd have to start work really early, like 2 or 3 a.m., to make sure I could drop everything off in time. Obviously, this was only during the summer when I didn't have school, so I really had no excuse for not being able to work. I liked doing the deliveries early though because it was calm and I didn't have to deal with anyone telling me what to do. On this day, I arrived at the warehouse at 3 a.m., loaded up, and then started making my way to the job site. It was a repair job on an old, maybe even abandoned, building at the edge of our town. When I got there, I saw a truck parked right outside. Its lights were off, and it didn't look like anyone was nearby. It was way too early for anyone to be working, so I wasn't expecting to see any cars here. I parked and got out, walking up to it and seeing that it wasn't a company vehicle either. The windows were tinted and I couldn't see inside. I turned and looked at the building, trying to see if anyone was there. I called out, asking if anyone was inside, but got no response. Feeling a little weird about it, I pulled out my phone and called my dad. It rang for a minute, then went to voicemail. Figuring it was probably just a worker's personal truck that they had left there, I went back to my truck and started unloading the materials. It took probably an hour, then I got back in and started to drive off. As I left the area though, I looked in my rearview mirror and suddenly the truck's lights turned on. I practically slammed on my brakes, stopping on the side of the road and watching as the truck started to back out. Someone had been in there the whole time. I was sure it couldn't have been a worker because they definitely would have responded to me. I sat and watched as they made their way out of the parking area and onto the road. I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed my dad's number again. While I waited for him to pick up, I looked over and saw the truck had stopped right next to me. I stared at their window, knowing someone behind it was probably staring at me. I tossed my phone on the seat and started to drive forward, but the truck quickly matched my speed and prevented me from getting back onto the road. There was nowhere else for me to go. To my left were trees, and to my right was this truck blocking my way. I started to panic, putting the car in reverse and trying to back up. The truck did the same until they tapped the side of my car, making me lose control and slide completely off the shoulder, hitting the side of a tree. The truck quickly stopped right at the top of the road as if they were going to get out. But then, their brake lights suddenly turned off again as they put it back in drive and sped away. Just 20 seconds later, another car pulled up to the side of the road, and a man got out and ran up to me, asking if I was okay. I didn't know his name at the time, but it was one of the workers who was just arriving at the job site. He only saw the last bit of what happened, but said he recognized the other truck as Samuel's, who was another worker my dad had hired a few months ago. As it turned out, a bunch of tools and materials were missing from the job site, adding up to almost $10,000. And that was just from that one night. He could have been slowly stealing a few things at a time over the past few months. I think what happened that night was that Samuel thought that by me seeing his truck, it would eventually all get traced back to him, and he'd get caught, so he tried to stop me. I don't know what he would have done to me, but considering I was the only witness, it's likely that he wouldn't have gotten caught as long as I was never seen again. Unfortunately though, his name and everything else didn't add up to anything, and it was likely that he was either an illegal immigrant or some kind of felon who went through the effort of getting fake or stolen IDs and work documents. I was never expecting something like that to ever happen, but at least it's really unlikely that I'll ever see that man again. I used to deliver Chinese food for a local restaurant. I was just a teenager in high school at the time, and whatever job I got wasn't going to be for more than a year or two. I'd say this job was fairly typical to most first jobs or retail and food service jobs because it had some slow and boring days and some busy and stressful days. As the delivery driver, though, I was always thankful to not have to be working in the store and dealing with mobs of customers. On this night, I started at 6 p.m. It was a Friday, so I was working a late 6 to 12 shift. As soon as I clocked in, I was delivering orders non-stop for the next 2 hours with no time to breathe in between them. At 8, orders were slowing a bit, but I still had a few more to deliver before I could take my lunch. So I grabbed the 3 orders and set out to get them done before 9. The first one was close, but the next 2 were further out. This isn't uncommon, as our town isn't all packed together. I got to the second house, dropped it off, and then headed out to the final stop. It was 10 minutes from where I was, and the tag said it wasn't paid for yet. All I was thinking about during this drive was the break I'd get afterward. Going back and forth for 3 hours straight tired me out more than usual that night. I pulled into the neighborhood and followed the GPS until I got to a back portion where the whole atmosphere quickly changed. I turned down a thin road of cracked pavement and potholes with barely visible small houses on the side, covered by thick bushes and unkempt lawns. When the GPS told me I had arrived, I stopped the car but didn't see a house. I turned my brights on, and ever so faintly I could see the outline of a small house pretty far from the road I was on. I then looked at the grass leading up to it and realized there was actually a driveway. It was just engulfed in vines and tall grass. I would never have seen it if I hadn't spotted the house first. Knowing I wouldn't be able to drive on it, I put the car in park, got out with the bag, and began to walk through the overgrown driveway. I couldn't believe how awful it was to walk through, and I couldn't imagine anyone letting their driveway get to this point. Getting closer, though, I could see more of the house. It was very small, kind of like a trailer home, and looked to be in a matching condition to the driveway vines growing over the windows and bushes covering every inch of the nearly decaying house. As I made my way up to the front door, I knew something was wrong. I knew it in my gut and in my head, but I was just some kid with a first job who was scared to lose it, so I felt like I had to do my job, which was to deliver the order to this address. I pushed all my bad feelings aside and knocked on the door. Right away, I heard footsteps coming up to the door. It opened, revealing a young lady behind it. At first, in the dim lighting, she looked very normal, and I felt a huge relief. But it only took a few more seconds to realize that her normal look was eerily out of place with the house in this condition. There was no way she could be so well dressed and taken care of. As these thoughts scrambled through my head, she opened the screen door and said in a creepily calm tone, "Come in." Everything hit me in that moment. I stumbled back a few steps and decided that I needed to leave right away. I turned around, and only a second after beginning to leave, I heard a thud from the side of the house. I looked over and saw 2 men running out from behind the house and sprinting through the bushes toward me. I dropped everything and started running. I did everything I could to get through the thick grass and vines, but just as I reached the end of the driveway, I stumbled to the ground, tripping over something. I hurried up, hearing their footsteps closing in on me. I couldn't even get myself to look back as I ran straight into my car, turning it on. The men immediately stopped and ran back to where they came from. With my whole body still shaking from the adrenaline, I turned the car around and drove away. Of course, I let my boss know what happened, and he urged me to call the police and report it. I was really relieved to know he didn't care about the order and was only concerned for my safety, which Looking back on it would have been horrible if it were any other way. Police interviewed me and my boss and did a whole investigation, ultimately unable to find any of the people. The property I was on, though, was actually state-owned, and the trespassing sign at the beginning of the road had been dug up and thrown into the tall grass. Their intentions are unknown, but it seems like the most obvious possibility is likely the answer. I just hope nobody else has to go through what I did, and if they do, I hope they can be as lucky as I was to get away. This happened during a road trip I was taking on the way back from seeing my family for the holidays. I'm not usually one to drive more than a couple of hours because I much prefer flying, but this year the tickets to where I was going were way more expensive for some reason. It would have cost me over $1,000 for a round-trip flight that only went a few states over. I had planned everything out so that I'd get home a few days before I had to go to work, but a snowstorm blew in on the day I was going to leave, so I had to stay an extra 2 days before finally starting the drive. The roads were empty since it was past the holiday rush, and most of the drive was pretty out of the way from the big cities. The hardest part of it was always staying awake and fighting the boredom. The first 8 or so hours went by without any trouble. Sure, I was tired, but the snow on the road kept me awake and attentive. It was about 10 p.m., and I had a hotel booked in a small town just 2 hours further ahead. But as I drove, a small light came up in my mirror. It was the headlights of someone behind me, which was actually the first person I'd seen on the road with me in over an hour. Their lights were getting bigger quickly, showing they were coming up really fast. Soon I could see that it was actually a large van of some kind. It was only a one-lane road, so I couldn't get out of their way, but I figured they would still swerve around me given they were going so fast. Once they reached the back of my car, though, they matched my speed and stayed behind me. After a few seconds, I realized they weren't trying to get around me, and we drove like that for almost 10 minutes. It was kind of unnerving, being that it was only us on the road, and yet this huge van was trailing right behind me. It wasn't a normal following distance either. They were so close that I couldn't even see their front bumper or license plate in my mirror. Maybe I was quick to feel uneasy about it, but an exit came up for a gas station, and I chose to turn off, hoping they would stay on the road and that I could put some distance between us. But as I veered off and down the exit ramp, they stayed right behind me. I pulled into the gas station and parked at one of the pumps as the van pulled into the pump behind me. At this point, I didn't know what was happening. Part of me thought this was something bad, but another part of me thought I was just overreacting. I knew this was the only gas station in the past 30 minutes, so it wasn't all that unlikely that they also needed gas. Before getting out to fill up my tank, I shut my car off and looked around. The store part of the gas station had its lights off and a closed sign hanging from the door. I looked to the sides of it, seeing nothing but empty darkness, no houses, no buildings, just a field covered in snow with a single road going through it. I looked in my mirror and saw a man standing outside of the van, putting gas in. So I got out and began doing the same. As the numbers slowly ticked on the gas meter, the man quickly put his pump back and sealed his gas cap. I looked over, seeing him walking to the back of his van. Then, I heard the loud ratcheting sound of the back door being lifted open. There was something in that moment, maybe a gut feeling or just instinct, that told me to get out of there. I pulled the pump out of my car, and not even a second later, 3 men were sprinting at me from around the back of the van. I dropped the pump on the ground and quickly got into my car, locking the doors just as one of them grabbed the handle and tried to rip it open. I was shaking and moving as quickly as I could to get the car on. All 3 of them went around trying each door, but then immediately sprinted back to their van before I even had the chance to pull away. When I did, though, I saw them drive away soon after, going in the opposite direction down the way we had come from. I let the police know what happened, but never even got a call back with any updates. I think it's obvious they were trying to abduct people under the cover of night on the vast, unpopulated highway. What's terrifying is how confident, and for lack of a better word, professional the whole operation was. It seemed that as soon as they realized I was securely in my car, and it wasn't going to be effortless, they fled the scene without even needing to communicate with each other. It was like they had done it many times before. What would have happened if they had gotten me? I don't know, but I urge everyone to learn from my mistakes because you may not be as lucky as I was. It was a typical Friday after my college classes were out, and I was spending the night doing DoorDash. This was my regular routine, dashing on the weekends to help me pay for all my living expenses while on campus. The night started well, with me getting a lot of orders done and making a good amount of money. Then it hit a stalemate after the big dinner rush. Very few orders were showing up, and the ones that did were very low paying, basically a waste of time. After an hour of aimlessly driving around, an order came through that wasn't too bad. It was 8 miles away, but the payment was well worth it. It wasn't absurd, but enough to make it not feel like a ripoff like many of the other ones. I accepted the order, ran into the restaurant to grab the bag, then hopped into my car and started driving. The map said it would take 30 minutes, which I think was the longest of any orders I'd done up until this point. Most of the houses were right around campus. Anything further than 15 to 20 minutes out became pretty much bare fields of grass. As I got to that 20-minute mark, it became just that very few houses, mostly sitting far out in fields of crops, and nothing else. The rest of the 10-minute drive was on this empty road going along these farms. Finally, I made it to the house. There was a dirt driveway connecting to the road, leading through a large field, and in the far back was a small house. Driving through the field felt very eerie, even though I'm not one to get nervous without reason. This felt different. As I got further from the road, the only sound was the low rumbling of my car on the dirt. I parked out front, got the bag ready, and left the car running as I stepped out. The night was quiet, and the house was dark, having only the porch light on to illuminate the outside. I walked through the unkempt grass and up to the porch, knocking on the door. As I waited, I looked back at my car sitting in the dark, with the field of pitch black behind it. A moment went by, so I knocked again, but there was no response, not even the sound of anyone inside. It didn't take long for me to realize the strangeness of the situation. Seeing no lights on in the windows and noticing how decayed the house looked up close, I began to feel uneasy. The only thing that made me think it couldn't be abandoned was that I had an order for this address, and the porch light was on. I looked at the light, thinking, why would that be the only light on then? By some odd chance, I recognized the top portion of the casing having a cheap solar battery. It was just an automatic light that charges during the day and turns on in the evening, meaning nobody had to be here to turn it on. Just as I was piecing this all together, I heard a rumbling sound behind me. I turned and saw a car driving down the dirt path, coming up right behind my car. I stood there, staring at their headlights until a man stepped out. I yelled from the porch, asking if this was his order, but he didn't reply. He just stood right next to his car and didn't move or speak. I felt my adrenaline spike as I began realizing how horrible the situation likely was. The silence of the night only reminded me that there was nobody here to help. I was stuck in the middle of a field, between an empty house and a stranger. In a split-second instinctual reaction, I dropped the bag and sprinted off the porch, running behind the house and straight into the field of grass. I looked back, seeing the man coming up behind me. Frantically, I continued running, and the further out I got, the thicker and taller the grass became until it was covering all views of direction. By then, I knew the guy had no chance of following me. I slowed down, catching my breath as I carefully moved through the crops, trying to be quiet in case the man was still trying to find me. Eventually, I made it to someone else's yard. From there, I got to a road where I had enough signal to call for help. The police picked me up and went to check on my car, but of course the man was gone by then. I was surprised though because my car hadn't been looted, and the bag of food was still on the porch of the abandoned house. That could only mean that the man had other intentions, likely far worse than just robbing me.